15 accountants failed. But the poor delivery girl showed up and told the millionaire, "Don't sign this." And what he did surprised everyone. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Riley Martinez rushed into the elevator trying to balance the thermal bag with the CEO's special lunch in one hand. Destined for none other than Dexter Lancaster, the most feared man in the Empire Tower, and a freshly squeezed orange juice in the other. Everything had golden labels. Everything came with ridiculously specific instructions. No onions, no garlic, and rice cooked at the perfect point between moist and dry, as if anyone could cook rice with a ruler. Bossy millionaire, of course he had to be. A Scorpio, Riley muttered, glancing at the elevator ceiling as if it could answer her. When she stepped out, the sign at the end of the hallway read 47B, but the delivery label said 47A. "Okay, Riley, breathe. Just letters. Letters and numbers. You've got this, girl. You used to deliver sushi on a bike in the middle of winter. You survived the vegan buffet Christmas madness. You can walk to a door without messing this up," she whispered to herself. But this was Riley. And with Riley, the unexpected was always around the corner. Instead of turning left toward the 47A reception, she went right. The hallway was quieter and darker, lined with massive potted plants that looked like they belonged in a Dubai hotel. Then she heard voices. "What?" she mumbled, almost tripping over her sneakers. The sound came from a room up ahead, its door slightly ajar. Riley was about to announce herself when one sentence froze her in place. "You all understand perfectly, right?" said a firm, controlled male voice. "Do the calculations completely wrong. Tell Dexter he'll make 10 times more from this merger with Meridian Corp. Get him to sign the contract immediately." Riley's eyes widened. The voice belonged to a tall, elegant man she vaguely recognized, George Hartwell, Dexter's partner. The kind of man who smiled with his lips but never with his eyes. In reality, he'll lose everything. 10 times more than he invests. One move and it's done. George finished, while the other men in the room, 15 of them, all in suits, looking like they slept, hugging calculators, muttered tensely among themselves. Riley didn't know what to do. Instinctively, she slipped behind one of the giant plant pots near the door and froze, her heart pounding loud enough to be picked up by satellites. 10 times the loss? A scam? Merger? Wrong numbers? "This is serious, really serious," she whispered under her breath. George went on, "I don't care if any of you feel uncomfortable, you've been paid, and the contract is ready." He paused for effect. "The signing happens in 10 minutes. No hesitation in the boardroom. If Dexter asks for a review, say you've already validated the scenarios. Projected profit is 10x. Repeat 10x like a mantra. He loves round numbers. Once he signs, he's finished." A heavy silence followed. The accountant simply nodded. Riley, on the other hand, felt like she had forgotten how to breathe. She knew Dexter was arrogant, yes, the kind of CEO who probably had a golf club hidden behind his leather chair. But did he deserve this? She looked down at the thermal bag in her hands. The lunch was still warm. She had come to deliver food and somehow stumbled into a plan to destroy the CEO of the tallest company in the building. Who was she in all this? Just a small-time delivery girl with a backpack that smelled like yakisoba and a history of late rent payments. Should she do something? Or would she just look like another crazy person getting kicked out by security? "Of course, he won't believe me," she thought, biting her lower lip. A delivery girl saying she overheard a corporate sabotage plan while hiding behind a plant? Sounds like a bad comedy script. She peeked through the crack in the door again. The men were standing up. George straightened his jacket with a satisfied smile. The accountants exchanged guilty glances. Then, one by one, they left the room and headed toward the boardroom. Riley crouched lower behind the plant, clutching the lunch bag like it was a shield. When the hallway finally went silent again, she slowly stood up, her legs trembling. She was about to make a run for it when footsteps echoed across the marble floor. She froze. Dexter Lancaster. In his perfectly tailored suit, walking with purpose, he glanced at her briefly, phone in hand, and said in a firm tone, "Good morning." "Good morning," she stammered, swallowing hard. He walked straight in and entered the meeting room, now carrying papers ready to be signed. Riley saw him through the glass. Dexter sat at the head of the table, with George by his side, gesturing animatedly while presenting documents. 15 accountants formed a semicircle around the table, all forcing polite smiles hidden behind their professionalism. Riley froze. The world seemed to slow down. Are you really going to let him sign that, knowing what you know? She glanced at the clock. Exactly noon. The exact time for the delivery. The exact time to change someone's destiny. Or not. As much as she thought Dexter was arrogant and bossy, and as much as she often wanted to throw juice in his face whenever she read his ridiculous list of demands, she wasn't the kind of person to stay quiet in the face of injustice. Especially one this big. But what if he fires me? Technically, I work for him, since the restaurant I work at is inside his company. What if they call security? What if I get arrested? Or worse, what if he doesn't believe me? No, that's crazy. Riley took a deep breath. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds and told herself, too bad for him. There will be seasoning, there will be sauce, and there will be truth. With her head held high and the lunch bag in hand, she turned around, straightened her wrinkled uniform, and put on a smile. Courage, Riley. It's now or never. The worst that can happen is they throw me out the window. Well, considering we're on the 47th floor, maybe that's not the worst scenario, she murmured to herself. She knocked softly on the glass door, producing a faint sound that barely carried. Everyone in the room turned to look at her. George frowned with obvious irritation. Dexter simply waved his hand, signaling for her to come in. Riley pushed the door open and stepped inside. Mr. Dexter, she exclaimed with a radiant smile that could light up half of Los Angeles. I brought your lunch. It's warm and delicious, just the way you like it. Dexter looked at her with an expression mixing confusion and impatience. Just leave it on the side table, he said, pointing without looking up from the papers in front of him. But Riley wasn't the type to follow simple instructions when a bigger mission was at stake. Oh, but Mr. Dexter, the chef made sure to use special spices today, she continued, slowly walking toward the main table while holding the bag as if it were a treasure. There's freshly ground black pepper, which, according to my grandma Martha, is the secret to keeping away negative energy and scammers. George raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Can she just leave the food and go? We're in the middle of an important meeting, he said, his tone cutting through the air. Of course, Riley replied cheerfully. But just look at this rice, made with imported saffron from, well, the place that makes the best saffron in the world. And there's a secret ingredient only I know about. Dexter sighed deeply. And what would that secret ingredient be? One of the accountants asked, genuinely curious. True love, Riley said with a wink, and a little bit of hope that people can still be honest with each other. The room fell silent for a moment. George drummed his fingers on the table with growing impatience. Riley, right? Dexter said, reading her name from her badge. Just leave the lunch on the side table so we can continue our meeting. But wait, Riley exclaimed, deliberately stepping closer to the main table. Mr. Dexter, you have to smell this amazing aroma before it gets cold. She held the thermal bag right under Dexter's nose as he leaned over the contracts. The aroma really was delicious, but Riley had other plans. Just smell how wonderful this is, she said, pretending to trip over her own foot. What happened next unfolded like a scene in slow motion. The thermal bag flew open in midair, releasing a cascade of seasoned rice, sautéed vegetables, and grilled chicken, which majestically scattered across the contracts, Dexter's perfectly tailored suit, and part of the meeting table. The cup of orange juice Riley had been holding in her other hand met its fate on Dexter's Italian tie, creating an abstract masterpiece in shades of orange. Oh no, Riley cried, bringing her hands to her face in a performance worthy of an Oscar. I'm so clumsy. Mr. Dexter, please forgive me. I tripped over my own foot. My mom always told me to take dance lessons, but I thought it was silly. And now look at this. Dexter was sitting in his chair, completely still, with rice stuck to his lapel, sauce dripping down his tie, and orange juice running from his perfectly combed hair. His expression was a mix of shock, disbelief, and a quickly growing anger. George exploded. You did this on purpose, he shouted, jumping out of his chair. How dare you interrupt such an important meeting with this nonsense? Riley looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. Nonsense? Mr. George, you're being very cruel to me. It was an accident, she protested. Although I have to admit, Mr. Dexter looks pretty stylish with that ginger sauce. Stains on clothes are the new trend, you know. I read about it in a lifestyle magazine last week. Executives who aren't afraid to get messy on the way to success. One of the younger accountants let out a muffled laugh, but quickly straightened up when George shot him a sharp glare. This is unacceptable. George continued. Mr. Dexter, this woman should be fired immediately. Riley kept up her act, grabbing some napkins from the side table and stepping closer to Dexter. Let me help clean this up, Mr. Dexter. I promise I'll make it spotless, she said, trying to wipe the sauce off his tie but only managing to spread it further. Dexter finally reacted, standing up abruptly. Enough, he said, his voice echoing across the room. Enough of this disaster. Everyone out. The meeting is postponed until tomorrow morning. George tried to protest. But Dexter, we can still continue. It's just a small— I said it's postponed, Dexter yelled, with rice still stuck to his forehead. Everyone get out of my way before I completely lose my composure. The 15 accountants left the room like soldiers in retreat, whispering among themselves. George passed Riley with a glare sharp enough to cut steel. This isn't over, he muttered under his breath, low enough for only her to hear. Riley just smiled and waved cheerfully. Have a wonderful rest of the day, Mr. George. When everyone was gone, Dexter walked toward the door, still dripping ginger sauce. Riley followed him through the Empire Tower corridors. Mr. Dexter? Please wait, she called, running after him. Dexter stopped abruptly and turned to face her, his expression showing pure exhaustion. What else do you want now? He asked, his voice tired. You've ruined my meeting, ruined my clothes, and ruined my lunch. What else could possibly go wrong today? Riley stopped at a safe distance. Mr. Dexter, I know I probably look completely out of my mind, and I admit my coordination skills aren't the best, but I need to talk to you about something very important. Riley, if this is about some personal problem or a complaint about the restaurant— It's not about the restaurant, she interrupted. It's about you, about your company, about people who aren't who they seem to be. Dexter looked at her more closely now, noticing something different in her voice. The playfulness was gone, replaced by genuine urgency. I promise I won't get too close to you to avoid any more incidents, Riley said, raising her hands as if surrendering. But please, just give me 2 minutes in your private office. It's about something I overheard, something you need to know before you sign any documents tomorrow. Dexter stayed silent for a long moment, studying Riley's face. There was something in her eyes that made him hesitate. Finally, he sighed deeply. 2 minutes, he said, pointing toward his office. And don't even think about getting near my desk. Riley smiled with relief. Thank you, Mr. Dexter. You won't regret it. I already regret it, he muttered, still picking grains of rice off his jacket sleeve as they walked down the hall. Riley entered the office, keeping the promised distance, standing close to the door while Dexter headed to his private bathroom to try to clean up. 2 minutes start now, he said, disappearing behind the bathroom door. Riley looked around the office, impressed by the luxury but nervous about the weight of what she was about to reveal. How do you start a conversation about corporate fraud with someone who was just attacked by a lunch? Mr. Dexter, she called out toward the bathroom. Do you remember I said I overheard something important? Just say it, came his muffled reply, accompanied by the sound of vigorous paper towel use. Riley took a deep breath. Well, I kind of got lost in the hallway this morning and overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to. A conversation about you, about a contract, and about how you're going to lose a lot of money if you sign that document. Continue, said Dexter, now paying closer attention. Mr. George was in a room with 15 men in suits, all looking like they had just swallowed sour lemons. And he said— Riley stopped and cleared her throat, preparing for her performance. He said this: You all understand perfectly, right? You must do the calculations completely wrong. She started imitating George's voice, making it deeper and more dramatic. Tell Dexter he's going to make 10 times more with this merger with Meridian Corp. Get him to sign that contract right away. In reality, he's going to lose everything. 10 times more than he invests. Dexter came out of the bathroom wearing a clean shirt but still looking skeptical. And then the accountants, Riley continued, now mimicking different voices. They were like, "Yes, Mr. George, we'll trick the boss, no problem," but with the tone of someone being forced to eat cold broccoli. "Riley," Dexter interrupted, sitting down in his executive chair, "are you telling me you overheard my partner and 15 accountants plotting to deceive me?" "Exactly," she replied, thrilled that he finally understood. "And it wasn't the kind of talk where they said, maybe this could go wrong. It was more like, we're going to destroy Dexter and then celebrate with champagne." Well, okay, they didn't actually say champagne, but that was the vibe. Dexter studied her for a long moment. "Riley, do you realize how absurd this sounds? George has been my partner for 5 years. The accountants have worked for me for decades. And you are, well, a delivery girl who just ruined an important meeting with a flying lunch." Riley felt a pang in her chest. It was exactly what she had imagined he would say. "I know how it sounds," she said with a sincerity that cut through her usual humor. "Believe me, I can't believe I'm even standing here saying this. But Mr. Dexter, I swear on the memory of my great-grandma Dolores who made the best chocolate cake in Texas, that I heard every word of that conversation." "Your great-grandma was from Texas?" "Actually, she was from Ohio, but she moved to Texas after meeting my great-grandpa, who raised cattle and—" Riley stopped, realizing she was drifting off topic. "The point is, I'm not lying." Dexter leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers on the desk. "Let's say, just for a moment, that you're telling the truth. Why would they do this?" "That's an excellent question," Riley said quickly. "I was wondering the same thing. Maybe they want your company? Or maybe Mr. Waffen, George has a gambling debt and needs your money to pay off a loan shark? Or maybe he's secretly always been jealous of your success and decided it was finally time for revenge. Or maybe," Dexter said slowly, "a delivery girl is trying to get attention by making up an elaborate and ridiculous story." Riley felt like she had just been punched in the stomach. "Mr. Dexter, I understand your distrust. I really do. If I were you, I'd probably think I was crazy too. But—" She paused, searching for the right words. "But what if I'm right? What if tomorrow you sign that contract and lose everything?" Something in Riley's voice made Dexter hesitate. There was a genuine urgency there, a desperation that didn't sound fake. "All right," he finally said, "I'll give you a chance. If you really heard this conversation, there must be proof. Documents, emails, some kind of solid evidence of this supposed plan." Riley lit up instantly. "You want me to be a private detective? I want you to prove what you're saying. You have until tomorrow morning. If you bring me real evidence, I'll reconsider signing the contract. If you bring me nothing, I'll be banned from the Empire Tower forever?" "Something like that," Dexter confirmed. Riley extended her hand toward him. "Deal," she said. "Get ready, Mr. Dexter, because when I take on a mission, I'm like a bulldog chasing bacon, relentless with an excellent sense of smell." Dexter shook her hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip. "And Riley," he said as she headed for the door. "Yes? Try not to destroy anything else in the process." Riley laughed out loud. "I promise I'll try to keep the damage to a minimum." She left the office with a confident smile, but as soon as the door closed, her expression shifted to pure determination. She had a mission now, and she wasn't going to fail. In the hallway, Riley was walking quickly toward the elevators when a familiar voice made her stop. "Riley." She turned and saw George Hartwell approaching, wearing a smile that never reached his eyes. He was impeccable again, as if the chaos from the earlier meeting had never happened. "Mr. George," she said, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. "How are you? Were you able to get all that ginger sauce out of your clothes too?" "Perfectly clean, thank you," he replied, stopping uncomfortably close to her. "Tell me, did you enjoy the meeting today?" The question sounded innocent, but there was something in the way he asked it that made Riley alert. "Well, fun isn't exactly the word I'd use," she replied with a forced laugh. "I'd say it was more of a learning experience about the dangers of carrying food on unstable trays." George chuckled, but the sound was empty. "You know, Riley, accidents can be very dangerous, especially when they happen in the wrong places, at the wrong times." "True," she agreed, keeping her tone light. "That's why I always wear non-slip shoes. Safety first, as they used to say in delivery school." "There's a delivery school?" Not really. I just made that up, she said with a wink. But there should be. George studied her for another moment, his smile growing colder. Well, I hope you're careful with accidents and don't get hurt, he said. Some things are better kept between us, don't you think? Riley felt a shiver run through her but kept her cheerful facade. Of course, I'll be very careful. Well, I should go. I have other deliveries to make. Of course you do, George said, stepping back. Have a good rest of your day, Riley. And remember, be careful with accidents. Riley waved cheerfully and walked toward the elevator. But her heart was racing. When the elevator doors closed, she finally allowed her mask to drop. He knows, she thought. He definitely knows I heard something. As the elevator descended, Riley couldn't see George in the hallway, pulling out his phone and dialing a number. Hello? He said in a low, controlled voice. We have a problem with the restaurant delivery girl. 2 hours later, Riley was no longer just a delivery girl, but an amateur detective determined to save a stubborn CEO from his own naivety. She had traded the restaurant uniform for casual clothes and a beret she thought made her look more investigative. But in reality, it made her look like a lost French artist in Los Angeles. All right, Riley, she murmured to herself as she watched the busy lobby. You need proof. Documents, emails, recorded conversations. Something that proves you're not just some clumsy girl with a tendency to spill food on millionaires. She noticed that the 23rd floor housed the accountant's offices. Perfect. If there was any proof of the scam, that's where she'd find it. In the elevator, Riley pressed the button for the 23rd floor and mentally reviewed her action plan. But when the doors opened, her stomach dropped. 3 of the 15 accountants from the morning meeting were standing right in front of the elevator, as if they were waiting for her. Hi, she said, trying to sound casual. You have beautiful elevators here. The men looked at her with obvious suspicion. Riley stepped out as if nothing was wrong and turned left down the hallway, but she could hear footsteps following her. Great, she thought. A corporate chase. Definitely not in the delivery girl manual I never read. Riley quickened her pace, passing rooms with important names on the doors. Tax Analysis Department, Internal Audit Section, Executive Meeting Room. When she glanced over her shoulder, there were now 5 men following her, including 2 she recognized from the morning meeting. Excuse me, she called to a secretary rushing by with a stack of documents. Where's the ladies' room? End of the hall on the right, the woman replied, too busy to notice the little espionage comedy unfolding. Riley ran down the hall and slipped into the women's restroom, locking the door behind her. At least there she had a few minutes to think about her next move. But as she washed her hands, she heard male voices outside. She went into the ladies' room. We can't go in there. Then we wait until she comes out. Riley looked around desperately. There was a small window, but they were on the 23rd floor. Unless she had suddenly developed superhero skills, that wasn't an option. That's when she noticed a cleaning cart abandoned in the corner, complete with a uniform hanging on a hook. A light bulb went off in her head. 5 minutes later, Riley walked out of the bathroom wearing the blue cleaning uniform, a cap pulled low over her eyes and pushing the cart. The accountants glanced at her but didn't recognize her. Excuse me, she said, lowering her voice and putting on a vaguely Midwestern accent. I need to clean this area. Leak on the floor above. The men stepped aside, allowing her to pass with the cart. Riley could hardly believe it had worked. She pushed the cart down the hallway, pretending to wipe down a few surfaces while keeping an eye on the office doors. She needed to find George's office, or at least a place where she could overhear something important. That's when she heard a familiar voice coming from a room with the door slightly open. That's right, George was saying on the phone. She's trying to gather information. But don't worry, I've got everything under control. Riley stopped the cart right next to the door, pretending to clean the floor while listening carefully. Dexter will never suspect me, George continued, with a confidence that made Riley feel sick. We've been friends since we were 8 years old. We grew up on the same street, went to the same school, the same college. He trusts me more than anyone else in the world. Riley felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Childhood friends. That changed everything. This wasn't just corporate betrayal. It was the destruction of a decades-long friendship. That clueless delivery girl has no idea what she's up against, George said with disdain. But we can't underestimate her. She managed to convince Dexter to listen to her crazy theories. I'm going to plant some evidence to make her look like a blackmailer. Fake documents showing she tried to extort other businessmen. Riley gripped the broom handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. He was planning to frame her. Prepare the documents we discussed, George went on. A fake criminal record, evidence of past blackmail attempts, the whole package. By the time I'm done with her, Dexter won't believe a word she says and will watch her get arrested for extortion. The call ended, and Riley heard George's chair creak as he got up. She quickly started scrubbing the floor harder, keeping her head down. The door swung open, and George stepped out, almost bumping into the cleaning cart. Careful with that floor, Riley said, disguising her voice and keeping her eyes down. Sorry, George mumbled distractedly, walking past her down the hallway. As soon as he disappeared, Riley dropped the broom and ran to the nearest elevator. Her heart was pounding. She now had crucial information. George and Dexter were childhood friends, and George was planning to frame her with fake evidence. But when the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, Riley came face to face with a problem. George was standing there along with 6 accountants, all staring directly at her. Hello, Riley, George said with a cold smile. Or should I say, Janitor Riley? Riley glanced down and realized she was still wearing the cleaning uniform. Her cover was blown. Oh, she said, trying to keep her voice casual. It's just that I have multiple jobs. The economy is tough. You know how it is. Of course you do, George replied. And I'm sure one of your specialties is gathering information? Riley felt sweat trickling down her back, but kept her smile. Information? Mr. George, the only things I collect are recyclable bottles and discount coupons. And dust, of course. There's a lot of dust in this building. Interesting, George said, taking a step toward her. Because I've been told a certain delivery girl has been asking questions about confidential company documents. You must have me confused with someone else, Riley replied, slowly backing away. We delivery girls all look the same in uniform. It's like a fascinating sociological phenomenon. George didn't look convinced, but before he could respond, the elevator doors closed between them. Riley had managed to escape, but she knew her freedom to investigate was over. As the elevator descended to the lobby, she realized she urgently needed a new plan. George was one step ahead, and now he knew she was digging. Even worse, he was setting up a trap that could destroy not only her chances of saving Dexter, but also her own life. When the doors opened, Riley quickly stepped out, tore off the cleaning uniform, and tossed it into a trash bin. She needed to think, and she needed to think fast. The 30-year friendship between George and Dexter was her biggest disadvantage, but maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to turn it into her greatest weapon. Dexter Lancaster sat alone in his luxurious office, watching the orange sunset spread over Los Angeles through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Something was troubling his mind, something he couldn't quite name. Riley Martinez, the chaotic delivery girl who had turned his meeting into a comedy scene and then appeared with an unbelievable story about corporate betrayal. Why couldn't he stop thinking about her? He leaned back in the leather executive chair, drumming his fingers on the mahogany desk. There was something in Riley's desperate sincerity that unsettled him. The way she looked at him when she spoke about the supposed scheme, the genuine urgency in her voice, as if she truly cared about what would happen to him. Ridiculous, he muttered to himself. A delivery girl who barely knows me, worried about my business? But then his thoughts drifted to George, his partner, his oldest friend. If Riley's accusations were true, Dexter closed his eyes, and his mind involuntarily wandered back in time. He was 8 years old, running through George's backyard wearing a Superman t-shirt and scraped knees. George was right behind him, laughing as they chased an imaginary dog that had stolen their makeshift superhero capes. When we grow up, we're going to be business partners, George had shouted that day, climbing up their favorite tree. We'll have the biggest company in the world and be best friends forever. Promise? Dexter had asked, holding out his pinky. Promise, George replied, sealing the pact with their intertwined fingers. The years rushed through Dexter's memory like a fast-forwarded movie. Elementary school, where George always shared his lunch when Dexter forgot his own. High school, where they were an inseparable duo on the debate team. Business school, where they worked on projects together and dreamed of the future that awaited them. And then came the first ventures. Sleepless nights planning strategies. The modest celebrations when they landed their first clients. George had always been there, always supporting him, always believing in their shared dream. 30 years of friendship. How could he doubt that because of a stranger's words? A firm knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," Dexter said, straightening up in his chair. George walked in with a serious expression, carrying a brown folder that seemed to hold important documents. "Dexter, we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. "I heard the ridiculous accusations that delivery girl made today." Dexter sighed. "George, I know it may sound absurd, but—" "May sound?" George interrupted, sitting down in the chair across from him. "Dexter, are you really considering the words of a woman you just met over mine? Over 30 years of partnership and friendship?" There was genuine pain in George's voice, and it hit Dexter right in the chest. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Dexter said calmly. "I just thought I should mention what she said." George opened the folder and spread several documents across the desk. "Well, since we're talking about it, I think you should see this." Dexter glanced down at the papers. They were official documents, private investigation reports, photographs, all of them related to Riley Martinez. "What is this?" "I had her investigated after today's incident," George explained, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Dexter, she has a record, a history of trying to blackmail wealthy businessmen with made-up stories." Dexter picked up one of the reports, his eyes scanning the information quickly. It included supposed evidence showing that Riley had tried to extort money from 3 other executives over the past 2 years, always using the same method, inventing stories about corporate scams and then asking for rewards for saving their companies. Dexter was stunned. "Look at the dates, Dexter. The company names, the investigators' signatures. It's all documented," George said, leaning forward. "She's a professional con artist who took advantage of you being vulnerable after the lunch incident." Dexter studied a photograph showing Riley talking to a man in a suit at an upscale restaurant. The caption read, "Riley Martinez demanding $50,000 from the CEO of Morrison Industries for information she made up that could save the company." "I can't believe this," Dexter said, though his voice trembled. George stood and walked toward the window, gazing out at the city below. "Dexter, you've known me since we were kids," he said, without turning around. "Remember when we promised we'd always be partners? That we'd always protect each other?" The memory of their childhood promise hit Dexter like a wave. "Of course I remember." "Then tell me," George said, turning around, genuine tears in his eyes. "How can you believe that after everything we've been through, I would ever try to hurt you?" Dexter felt his heart break. George was right. 30 years of friendship, loyalty, and partnership couldn't be thrown away because of a stranger's claims, no matter how convincing she seemed. "You're right," Dexter finally said. "I'm sorry, George. I don't know what I was thinking." George smiled in relief and went back to his chair. "Don't apologize. She's very convincing, and you've always been a man with a good heart. That's one of the things I admire most about you." "What do we do about the Meridian Corp contract?" "We'll schedule a new meeting for Monday morning," George replied. "And this time, no interruptions from crazy delivery girls." At that moment, there was another knock on the door. Without waiting for an answer, Riley walked into the office with a determined expression. Even seeing George there, she knew she had to speak. "Mr. Dexter," she said, holding some papers in her hands. "I got the evidence you asked for. I heard George on the phone and—" "Stop," Dexter interrupted her, his voice cold as ice. "That's enough, Riley." Riley froze, confused by the sudden change in his tone. "But Mr. Dexter, I found out that you and he are childhood friends, and that makes it even worse. He's betraying 30 years of—" "I said stop," Dexter exploded, rising sharply from his chair. "I've discovered your true nature, Riley Martinez. I found out about your other so-called rescue jobs at other companies." Riley glanced at the documents scattered across the table, her eyes widening in horror. This isn't real," she whispered. "Mr. Dexter, that evidence is fake. George is trying to frame me." No more lies, Dexter said coldly. I want you out of my company immediately and never to return. If you try to come near me or any employee at Empire Tower again, I'll call security. Tears began streaming down Riley's face. Mr. Dexter, please, just listen to me. Give me 5 minutes. I can prove that. Get out, Dexter shouted. Riley looked at George, who wore a discreet, satisfied smile, then at Dexter, whose expression was full of disgust and total disappointment. With a muffled sob, she ran out of the office. George stood up and placed a reassuring hand on Dexter's shoulder. You did the right thing, he said softly. On Monday, we'll finally close the Meridian Corp deal and move on. Dexter nodded, but something in his chest still ached. He had seen the tears in Riley's eyes when she ran out, and they seemed far too genuine to be part of some elaborate scheme. But George was right. 30 years of friendship couldn't be a lie. Couldn't. Riley spent the entire night planning her revenge. Sitting in the small apartment she shared with 2 roommates, she scribbled diagrams of Empire Tower on used napkins and wrote out possible strategies on scraps of paper. After being humiliated and thrown out of Dexter's office, she was determined to prove her innocence, even if it was the last thing she ever did. If he won't listen, I'll have to find proof so clear even a blind man could see it, she muttered to herself, chewing on the tip of a cheap pen. The next morning, Riley returned to Empire Tower dressed like a low-level executive, wearing a suit borrowed from one of her roommates who worked at an accounting firm. The suit was 2 sizes too big, making her look like a kid playing dress-up, but at least it would help her blend in as she walked through the halls. She knew George always had lunch at the executive restaurant on the 40th floor at 12:30 sharp. This would be her chance to get into his office and look for real evidence of the scam. At 12:20, Riley positioned herself near the executive elevator and watched George walk out, impeccable as always, heading to lunch. As soon as he disappeared, she hurried down the hall toward his office. George's secretary had also left for lunch, leaving the administrative area deserted. Riley approached his office door and, to her surprise, it was unlocked. Apparently, George doesn't expect to be spied on by vengeful delivery girls, she whispered, stepping into the luxurious office. George's office was a smaller version of Dexter's, but just as impressive, with shelves lined with business books and framed certificates covering the walls. Riley began searching quickly through drawers and files, looking for anything incriminating. Then George's phone rang. Riley froze, but quickly realized it was his other phone, the one he'd left on the desk. Apparently, he carried 2 and had taken only one with him to lunch. The ringing stopped, only to start again a moment later. This time, Riley had a brilliant idea. She grabbed her own phone and started recording just as George's phone rang for the 3rd time. George must have been returning earlier than expected because she suddenly heard his voice in the hallway, speaking to someone on the phone. The one he had taken with him. Yes, everything is going according to plan, George's voice said as he approached the door. On Monday, I'm going to destroy Dexter's company from the inside. You won't even know what hit him. Riley could hardly believe her luck. She was recording the perfect confession. But then she heard the doorknob turning. Panicking, she dove behind George's large desk, but in her rush, she tripped over her own feet and dropped her phone. The device slid across the polished floor and stopped under a heavy bookshelf filled with corporate law books. George walked into the office still talking on the phone. No, don't worry about the delivery girl. I've already handled her. Dexter now thinks she's a professional blackmailer. He laughed with satisfaction. The fake documents I prepared were very convincing. Riley crouched behind the desk, barely breathing, while her phone silently blinked beneath the bookshelf, still recording. If George discovered she was there, it would all be over. Of course, the accountants will cooperate, George continued. Each of them has their little secrets they'd rather keep hidden. It's amazing how cooperative people become when you have the right information on them. Riley's eyes widened. Blackmail. George was blackmailing all 15 accountants. What did you say about Johnson having gambling debts? Perfect. And Martinez has tax problems with the IRS? Even better. The more compromising the secrets, the more obedient they become. George said in a cruel tone Riley had never heard from him before. The conversation went on for several more minutes, with George explaining how he kept each accountant under his control using personal damaging information. When he finally hung up, Riley heard his footsteps coming dangerously close to where she was hiding. But then the office landline rang, making George walk to the other side of the room. Riley seized the chance to quietly crawl toward the bookshelf where her phone had landed. The phone was wedged deep beneath the heaviest part of the shelf. She stretched her arm, but her fingertips barely touched it. Desperate, she looked around and spotted an umbrella leaning against the nearby wall. While George talked on the phone about liquidating Meridian Corp's assets, Riley grabbed the umbrella and began using it like a makeshift fishing rod, trying to nudge her phone closer. Come on, she whispered, sweating as she maneuvered the umbrella to push the phone in the right direction. After several clumsy attempts, nearly knocking over a decorative vase and accidentally hooking a stray shoe under the shelf, Riley finally managed to push the phone close enough to grab it. She stretched her arm again and caught it. But just as she stood up with the phone in hand, she heard George wrapping up his call. "Perfect," he said. "Monday will be the day Dexter Lancaster falls." Riley ducked back behind the desk, her heart pounding so hard she was sure George could hear it. She looked down at her phone and saw it was still recording. She had everything. The full confession. George paced around the room for a few minutes, organizing papers. Riley could see his neatly pressed pants moving past the desk where she hid. Finally, she heard his footsteps heading toward the door and his voice in the hallway, chatting with the secretary who had just returned from lunch. Riley waited another 5 minutes before daring to come out of hiding. When she finally stood, her legs were numb and she was covered in dust. But she had the evidence. Not only George's confession about destroying Dexter's company, but also proof that he was blackmailing all 15 accountants. "The poor men aren't villains," she murmured to herself as she carefully left the office. "They're victims, too." Riley realized she had uncovered far more than she expected. George wasn't just a traitor. He was a cruel manipulator destroying lives to get what he wanted. The accountants weren't part of the scheme by choice. They were being forced. As she walked through the Empire Tower hallways, Riley formed a new plan in her mind. It wasn't enough anymore just to save Dexter. She had to free the 15 accountants from George's control and turn them from enemies into allies. "Get ready, George Hartwell," she whispered, clutching the phone with the recordings tightly against her chest. "The war has only just begun, and this time, I have ammunition." She smiled for the first time in days, imagining the look on George's face when he realized he had underestimated a simple delivery girl from Los Angeles. Riley Martinez might not have any experience in corporate espionage, but she had something far more valuable: pure determination and a recording that would change everything. Riley spent the rest of the afternoon studying the 15 accountants as if she were an anthropologist observing a rare tribe. She had already identified each of them during her little espionage adventures, and now needed to approach them one by one, away from George's watchful eyes. Her first target, potential ally, was Harold Johnson, a man in his early 50s with thick glasses and a perpetually worried expression. Riley found him alone in the break room, sadly stirring sugar into his coffee as if he were dissolving all his hopes along with it. "Mr. Johnson?" Riley approached him with her friendliest smile. "I'm sorry to bother you, but you don't look like you're having the best day." Harold looked up and immediately recognized her. "You're the delivery girl who caused that chaos in the meeting." "Guilty," Riley admitted cheerfully, sitting in the chair next to him. "But between us, it was a pretty convenient accident, wasn't it? I mean, no one really wanted to sign that contract anyway, right?" Harold nearly choked on his coffee. I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do," Riley said gently. "I saw your face in that meeting. You look like a man being forced to eat raw spinach. Nobody makes that face when they're about to close a good deal." Harold's shoulders slumped. "My situation is complicated," he murmured. Riley leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Money problems?" Harold stared at her, surprised. "How did you?" "Educated guess. You have that expression of someone lying awake at night doing math in their head. Let me guess, medical debts? Family troubles?" Tears started to form in Harold's eyes. My mother has Alzheimer's, he confessed. Her treatment costs a fortune, and my insurance, well, let's just say they're very creative at finding excuses not to pay. Riley felt her heart tighten. And George knows about this? He knows everything, Harold said bitterly, including a few bets I made when I was desperate. Bets that technically violate company policy. Let me guess. He told you that if you don't cooperate with his plan, he'll expose those bets, and you'll be fired for cause, losing any chance of helping your mom. Harold nodded miserably. Riley spent the next 2 hours having similar conversations with the other accountants. Robert Martinez was being blackmailed over problems with the IRS. Thomas Chen was drowning in an expensive divorce and alimony payments that consumed his entire salary. Kevin O'Sullivan had made a small mistake in a report years ago, but George had the proof and was threatening to use it to destroy his career. Each story was sadder than the last, and Riley grew more furious with George. Finally, she gathered all 15 accountants in the smaller conference room on the 23rd floor after convincing them they had a chance to free themselves. "Gentlemen," she said, standing at the head of the table like a general addressing her troops, "the time has come for a revolution." The men stared at her as if she had just suggested flying to the moon. "Riley," Harold said nervously, "we appreciate your enthusiasm, but George has too much power over all of us." "Exactly." Riley slammed her hand on the table. "He has power because you allow him to have it. But imagine if all 15 of you stood up at the same time and said, 'No, George, we're not going to be your puppets anymore.'" "He'll fire us all," Kevin muttered. "And then what?" Riley countered. "Do you really think he can replace 15 experienced accountants overnight? And more than that, imagine what Dexter will think when he finds out George fired every single accountant right before a major merger." The men began exchanging glances, a spark of hope lighting up their faces. "Besides," Riley continued, pacing around the table like an inspiring teacher, "I have evidence, recordings of George himself admitting he's blackmailing you and planning to destroy Dexter's company." "You have what?" Thomas asked, sitting up straighter. Riley held up her phone. "Everything's here. The full confession, the admission of blackmail, everything we need to expose George and free you all once and for all." A wave of excitement swept through the room. For the first time in months, the accountants actually looked hopeful. "So who's with me?" Riley asked, placing her hand in the center of the table. "Who's ready for the revolution of the 15? One by one, the accountants placed their hands over hers, forming a stack in the middle of the table. There were nervous laughs, but also determination. "At the next meeting," Riley said, "when George tries to force you to lie about the numbers, all of you stand up and tell the truth. Simple as that." "And what if he threatens to fire us?" Robert asked. "Leave that to me," Riley said with a confident smile. "I've got a few surprises prepared for Mr. George Hartwell." The men whispered excitedly among themselves about the plan. Riley was feeling triumphant when she heard slow clapping behind her. She turned and saw George standing in the doorway of the conference room, applauding sarcastically. "What an inspiring performance," he said, stepping into the room with a cruel smile. "Really moving. Too bad it's completely useless." Riley lifted her chin defiantly. "George, what a surprise. Are you here to join the revolution?" "Actually, I came to deliver a little update to your new friends," he said, pulling a sheet of paper from his jacket pocket. "A list of immediate terminations that will take effect if any of the 15 accountants dare to go against my instructions during Monday's meeting." Riley felt her stomach drop as she saw the fear return to the faces of the men who had just stepped out but were now peeking back through the doorway. "You see this?" George continued, addressing the accountants. "This is what happens when you listen to troublesome delivery girls. But don't worry. I'm still willing to forget this little rebellion if you all get back to your places and do exactly what we agreed." The accountants looked from George to Riley, their expressions shifting from hope to fear. "Sorry, Riley," Harold murmured, lowering his eyes. "I can't risk losing my job. My mother depends on me." One by one, the other accountants made the same choice, mumbling apologies as they stepped away from Riley as though she were radioactive. 15 against 1, George said with satisfaction. Doesn't look like the odds are in your favor, Riley. Riley stood alone in the conference room, staring at George with a mix of anger and disappointment. All her allies had deserted her at the first sign of real danger. Pathetic, George went on. Did you really think you could take down a carefully planned operation with inspiring speeches and cheap sentiment? I still have the recordings, Riley said, holding up her phone. Yes, your famous recordings, George laughed. Tell me, Riley, who do you think will believe the word of a known blackmailer over mine? Especially now that it's clear you tried to bribe my employees? At that moment, a familiar voice echoed from the hallway. What's going on here? Riley and George both turned to see Dexter standing in the doorway, looking confused. He had only heard the raised voices. Dexter, George said quickly. Glad you're here. This woman was trying to convince our accountants to sabotage Monday's meeting. Riley looked at Dexter and noticed something different in his eyes. For the first time, he didn't seem completely convinced by George's words. Is that true? Dexter asked, looking directly at Riley. Riley took a deep breath. This could be her last chance. Mr. Dexter, she said calmly, all I ever wanted was to stop you from being betrayed by your best friend. Dexter's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time since rejecting Riley, he seemed to actually be listening. He simply turned and walked away, murmuring to himself, I'm so tired of this. Dexter spent the rest of the day in a mental state that could only be described as an internal civil war. On one side, 30 years of friendship with George, childhood memories, promises of eternal loyalty. On the other, a chaotic delivery girl who had crashed into his life like a hurricane, leaving behind a trail of confusion, ginger sauce, and doubts he couldn't ignore. On Friday night, he decided to work late at Empire Tower, hoping the silence of the empty office would help him sort through his thoughts. But the more he thought, the more strange details came to mind. George had avoided his gaze during the entire Friday meeting. In 3 decades of friendship, Dexter had never seen George unable to look him straight in the eye. And Riley, well, Riley had never asked for anything in return. No money, no favors, no rewards. She had only tried to warn him about a danger. It was almost 10 at night when Dexter decided to take a walk through the quiet hallways of the company. The 47th floor was submerged in darkness, except for the emergency lights that cast long shadows across the marble floor. That's when he saw a light on in the company's dining area. Curious and slightly concerned about security, Dexter headed toward the light. To his surprise, he found Riley sitting alone at one of the tables in the restaurant, surrounded by papers and calculators, with a steaming cup of coffee beside her. She was so focused on her calculations that she didn't notice him approaching. Working late? Dexter asked, making her jump. Riley looked up, clearly surprised to see him. Mr. Dexter, she said quickly, gathering the papers. I was just organizing some things for the restaurant. Inventory, you know how it is. At 10 at night? Riley gave a sheepish smile. Well, I'm kind of a workaholic, and also a chronic insomniac, and I don't exactly have the most exciting social life. Honestly, my idea of fun is reorganizing my coupon collection in alphabetical order. Despite himself, Dexter found a smile forming. There was something refreshingly honest in Riley's self-deprecating humor. Mind if I sit? He asked, pointing to the chair across from her. Riley nodded nervously. Of course, though I should warn you, I have a history of causing food-related accidents when I'm nervous. And I'm really nervous right now, so maybe it's better to keep all liquids far away from us. Dexter sat down, studying her face under the restaurant's soft light. Without the pressure of accusations and confrontations from the past few days, Riley seemed different. More relaxed, more genuine. Riley, he said finally, tell me about you. Not about George, not about contracts or schemes. About you. Riley blinked, surprised by the question. Me? Well, there's not much to tell. I'm a delivery girl with a talent for getting into trouble. I come from a lower middle-class family in Texas. My mom's a nurse, my dad's a mechanic. I've got 2 younger brothers who are both way smarter than me. I doubt that, Dexter said. It's true. Tommy's studying aerospace engineering, and Jake wants to be a veterinarian. I'm the black sheep of the family who came to Los Angeles to find herself and ended up mostly finding overdue bills and shared apartments with people who think doing the dishes is optional. Dexter laughed, genuinely, for the first time in days. And why Los Angeles? Honestly? Riley smiled. I watched too many movies about people coming here and becoming famous. Apparently, my career plan was entirely based on 90s romantic comedies. And how's that working out? Well, I'm not famous yet, but I'm definitely living a comedy. Maybe not romantic, but definitely comedic. There was something about the way she spoke, a mix of humor and vulnerability, that stirred something deep inside Dexter. He had spent so long surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Money, favors, connections, that he had forgotten what it was like to talk to someone who simply talked. You mentioned hearing George talk about the calculations being wrong, Dexter said carefully. Do you understand finance? A little, Riley replied. My dad always taught me that if you're going to lend someone money, you'd better understand the numbers behind it. And working here, you end up overhearing a lot of conversations about profit margins, cash flow, risk analysis. You'd be surprised how much confidential information people share while they're eating. She paused, then added casually. For example, I know Empire Tower had liquidity issues in the third quarter last year because Mr. George mentioned it during a lunch with investors. And I know you lost the contract with Harrison Industries because of a flawed market analysis that cost about $2 million. Dexter stared at her, surprised. That was information only someone with inside access would know. How do you know about Harrison Industries? I heard Mr. George explaining it to one of the senior accountants about why they needed to be more careful with future projections. It was on a Thursday, about 3 months ago. He was eating that turkey sandwich he always orders when he's stressed. The details were too specific to make up. Dexter felt something shift inside his chest, a strange sensation that maybe, just maybe, he had misjudged Riley. Riley, he said, his voice softening, why do you care so much about what happens to me? For the first time since he had entered the restaurant, Riley looked straight into his eyes. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure. Maybe because I watched my father get betrayed by someone he trusted, and I know how that can destroy a person. Or maybe because, even though you're a bossy CEO and a little arrogant sometimes, there's something about you that makes me think you don't deserve to be deceived by someone who's supposed to protect you. There was a certain chemistry in the air between them. Something Dexter hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was deeper. A connection, a sense that he'd finally found someone who saw him as a person, not as a title or a bank account. It's getting late, he said finally, though reluctantly. You should head home. I know, Riley replied. I just need to finish organizing a few things here at the restaurant. Supplier documents, that kind of stuff. It'll only take another hour. Dexter stood up, hesitating for a moment. Riley? Yes. Thank you. For the conversation, I mean, it's been a long time since I actually talked to someone. You're welcome, Mr. Dexter, and thank you for listening to me without interrupting to say I'm crazy. After Dexter left, Riley waited 5 minutes to make sure he was really gone. Then she got up and started on the real reason she was there so late. She had noticed that some of the company's older files were stored in cabinets at the back of the restaurant, probably because it was a place no one would think to look for important documents. Riley began carefully going through the files, searching for anything that could incriminate George. It was in the financial records from 5 years ago that she found exactly what she needed. Documents showing suspicious transfers of company funds into personal accounts, all authorized by George Hartwell. The amounts were small enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but together they added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Gotcha, she whispered, taking photos of each document with her phone. On Monday morning, Riley arrived at Empire Tower before 7 o'clock, determined to show Dexter what she had found before he could sign anything. But when she reached the 47th floor, she saw George leaving Dexter's office with a satisfied smile on his face. Riley, he said with fake cheerfulness. What a surprise to see you here so early. Where's Mr. Dexter? She asked, ignoring his false greeting. Oh, I had to move up our meeting, George replied casually. Actually, we've changed the entire schedule. The contract will be signed at 8 o'clock sharp. Dexter's getting ready right now. Riley felt her blood run cold. 8 o'clock, but it's only 7:40. I know, George said with a cold smile. Time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? Riley glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at George, realizing she had walked right into his trap. He had moved up the signing specifically to stop her from interfering again. With just 20 minutes left, Riley would need a miracle to stop Dexter from signing away everything. She clutched the phone with the photos of the documents against her chest and took a deep breath. "All right, Riley," she murmured to herself. 18 minutes to save a stubborn millionaire from his backstabbing best friend. "You can do this." She ran toward the main elevators but stopped abruptly when she saw 2 company security guards blocking access. They recognized her instantly. "Sorry, Miss Martinez," one of them said, a tall man in a blue uniform. "We've been ordered not to let you access the executive floors." "Ordered by who?" Riley asked, though she already knew the answer. "Mr. Hartwell, company security matters." Riley forced a smile. "I understand. Well, you won't mind if I use the ladies' room over there in the corner, right?" She walked casually toward the restroom, but as soon as she turned the corner, she bolted for the emergency stairwell. The sign on the door showed she was on the 31st floor and needed to get to the 47th. 16 floors, she muttered, looking up the stairwell. "You've done worse, Riley. Remember that time you climbed 20 flights because the elevator broke down?" She started taking the stairs 2 at a time, her heart already racing. By the 33rd floor, she stopped for just a few seconds to catch her breath when she heard voices echoing through the stairwell. "She must be using the stairs," a male voice said. "Check all exits on the upper floors." Riley kept climbing, trying to keep a steady pace. Her legs were already burning, but she couldn't stop. By the 36th floor, she heard heavy footsteps coming down the stairs from above. "They're closing in on me," she whispered, pushing herself to move faster. When she reached the 38th floor, Riley had an idea. She had noticed during her deliveries that the service elevator on this floor was less monitored than the main ones. Maybe she could use it without being detected. She carefully opened the stairwell door and peeked into the hallway. Empty. Riley ran to the service elevator, and, to her surprise and relief, there were no security guards around. She pressed the button, and the doors opened immediately. "Finally, some luck," she murmured, stepping in quickly. Riley pressed the button for the 47th floor and leaned against the elevator wall, trying to steady her breathing. The digital display climbed slowly. 39th, 40th, 41st. On the 45th floor, the elevator stopped and the doors opened. To her complete surprise, Dexter stepped in, adjusting his tie and looking like he was preparing for the most important meeting of his life. "Riley," he said, his eyes widening. "What are you doing here?" "Mr. Dexter," she exclaimed, too relieved to hide it. "What luck finding you. I need to show you something urgent before the meeting." Dexter frowned. "Riley, we've already talked about this. George explained about your previous attempts with other businessmen." "The evidence was fake," she said desperately. "I have real proof this time. Documents showing George has been siphoning money from your company for years." "Riley, please." At that exact moment, the elevator lights went out completely, and it stopped with a jolt between floors. They were plunged into total darkness. "What happened?" Dexter asked, pressing several buttons, but nothing worked. Far away in George's office, he was on the phone with the head of maintenance. "Yes, cut the power to all the service elevators," he ordered. "We have a security situation and need to locate an unauthorized person in the building." Inside the dark elevator, Riley and Dexter were trapped together in the small space. The absolute darkness made every breath sound louder, every movement more noticeable. "Dexter," Riley whispered, "I know it's hard to believe me, but I need you to trust me just this once." "Riley, Please," she interrupted, her voice trembling in the darkness. "I know I'm just a delivery girl who causes food accidents. I know George has been your best friend for decades, but I also know you deserve to know the truth." In the dark, Dexter could feel the desperate sincerity in her voice, a sense of urgency far too real to be faked. "Why is this so important to you?" he asked softly. Riley hesitated for a moment, then decided to be completely honest. "Because I saw my father get betrayed by someone he trusted, and I know how that can destroy a person. And because I care about what happens to you." The silence that followed was deep. Then, in the complete darkness, Riley felt Dexter's hand gently touch her face. "Riley," he murmured. Before either of them could think twice, they were kissing. It was a soft kiss, but filled with all the tension that had built up between them over the past few days. When they pulled apart, both were breathing a little faster. "Wow," Riley whispered. "That was unexpected." Dexter let out a low laugh in the dark. "Sorry, I don't know what came over me." "Don't apologize," Riley said quickly. It was good. Really good, actually." They laughed together in the darkness, the tension easing for a brief moment. "Riley," Dexter said, his voice completely different now, "show me this proof you have." Riley pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The faint but sufficient light illuminated the small elevator space as she opened the photos of the documents. "Here," she said, showing him the screen. "Transfers of company funds to George's personal accounts over the past 5 years. Always small amounts to avoid detection, but together they add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars." Dexter studied the images carefully, his expression shifting from skeptical to shocked as he recognized the official documents and signatures. "This is real?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Completely real," Riley confirmed. "I found these documents in the old files stored at the restaurant, and I have more evidence too." Dexter leaned back against the elevator wall, reality finally sinking in. 30 years of friendship built on trust, and George had been betraying him for years. "I can't believe this," he murmured, running a hand through his hair. "George? How could he?" "I'm sorry, Dexter," Riley said gently. "I know how much this must hurt." Dexter looked at her in the dim glow of the cell phone light, seeing not just the chaotic delivery girl who had disrupted his meeting, but a brave woman who had risked everything to protect him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up, even when I didn't believe you." At that moment, the elevator lights flickered back on, and they began moving again. When the doors opened on the 47th floor, Dexter and Riley rushed down the marble hallway, still processing everything that had happened in the past few minutes. The kiss, the revelations, the betrayal of 3 decades finally exposed. "The main conference room," Dexter said, pointing to the end of the hallway. "If George is making a presentation to the board, it'll be there." They sprinted through the elegant corridors of the Empire Tower, passing secretaries who looked at them curiously. Riley still clutched the evidence on her phone, while Dexter tried to mentally process the magnitude of his best friend's betrayal. When they reached the large conference room, the scene waiting for them confirmed their worst fears. Through the transparent glass walls, they could see George at the head of the oval table, confidently gesturing to a group of 12 impeccably dressed men, the entire Empire Tower board of directors, and 3 key investors Riley recognized from her past deliveries. "No," Dexter murmured, trying the door handle. It was locked. Riley pressed her face against the glass, trying to hear the conversation through the soundproof walls. She managed to catch only fragments by reading lips, but it was enough to understand what was happening. "He's presenting the contract," she whispered to Dexter. "He's calling it the deal of the century." George pointed to colorful charts spread across the table, numbers Riley knew were completely fraudulent. The board members nodded, clearly impressed by the projected profits. "Mr. Lancaster?" A voice behind them made them turn. It was Margaret Sullivan, George's senior executive assistant, holding a sealed envelope. "Mr. Hartwell asked me to deliver this if you showed up," she said, looking uneasy about the situation. Dexter tore open the envelope quickly, his eyes scanning the official document. His expression grew darker with every line he read. "What does it say?" Riley asked, noticing the growing paleness on Dexter's face. "It's an emergency motion approved by the board," he replied, his voice rough. "George convinced them that I'm emotionally compromised because of unfounded accusations affecting my ability to lead." Riley felt her stomach sink. "Does that mean?" "It means they voted to proceed with critical executive decisions without my direct approval," Dexter explained, crumpling the paper slightly in his hand. "In exceptional cases, when they believe the CEO isn't fit to lead properly." Inside the room, George continued his theatrical presentation. He had prepared everything meticulously, turning his betrayal into a convincing performance of responsible corporate leadership. "How much time do we have?" Riley asked. glancing at the clock on the wall. According to this document, the final vote and contract signing will happen in 40 minutes. Dexter replied, just enough time for George to finish his presentation and secure all the necessary approvals. Riley stepped back from the glass wall, her mind racing. She needed a plan, something George couldn't predict or block. The accountants, she said suddenly, turning to Dexter. What? The 15 accountants George is blackmailing, she explained, pulling out her phone. This whole fraud only works because they provided the fake numbers George is showing right now. If we can get them to tell the truth, Riley, you said yourself they're too terrified to stand up to George, Dexter argued. They won't risk their jobs. Not individually, she agreed, scrolling quickly through the contacts she had collected. But what if they realize they're not alone? What if they knew that together, they're stronger than George? Riley found Harold Johnson's number and began dialing. What are you planning to do? Dexter asked. Something that's probably completely insane, she admitted, pressing the phone to her ear. But it might be our only chance. The call connected. Harold? This is Riley Martinez. I know this sounds crazy, but I need you to listen to me for just 2 minutes, she said quickly. Riley, I can't talk right now. If George finds out. Harold, George is right now in the main conference room, presenting all the fake numbers you and the others were forced to calculate to the board of directors, Riley cut in. In less than an hour, he's going to sign a contract that will destroy Empire Tower. And do you know who's going to take the blame when everything falls apart? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Keep talking, Harold said, his voice tense. While speaking with Harold, Riley motioned for Dexter to grab his own phone and start calling the other accountants. Robert Martinez? This is Dexter Lancaster, he said when the call connected. I know about your situation with the IRS, and I know George is using that against you. But you need to understand something. If this merger fails the way George has planned, you're going to lose your job anyway. Riley started a second call. Thomas? It's Riley again. I know you're scared. I know about the divorce and the alimony payments. But think about this. If George manages to destroy the company, you won't even have a paycheck to cover any of that. One by one, the calls were made. Riley and Dexter worked methodically, each speaking to different accountants, explaining the real situation and offering an alternative none of them had considered before. Kevin O'Sullivan? I need you to be brave for just a few minutes, Riley said during her fourth call. A few minutes of courage could save not only your job, but everyone else's too. Gradually, Riley began to notice a shift in the tone of the conversations. The fear was still there, but something else was starting to emerge. Anger. Anger at being manipulated, blackmailed, and used as pawns in a game they didn't fully understand. Finally, Riley managed to set up a conference call with 9 of the 15 accountants. Listen to me, all of you, she said, her voice gaining strength and emotion. You've spent months being intimidated by a man who preyed on your vulnerabilities. But you're qualified professionals, men of integrity who were put in an impossible situation. She paused, glancing through the glass at George, who was still delivering his manipulative presentation. George has power over each of you individually because each of you has been keeping your secrets to yourselves out of fear and shame, she continued. But imagine if all of you together stood up and told the truth. Imagine showing the board the real numbers, the honest projections, the evidence that George forced you to lie. And what if he fires us all? A nervous voice asked on the line. Dexter took the phone from Riley. Then you'll have solid grounds to sue the company for wrongful termination and coercion, he said firmly. And I personally promise to give each of you the strongest references possible to help you with new jobs. More importantly, Riley said, taking the phone back, you'll regain something George has been trying to take from you, your dignity. Not as men who were intimidated and silenced, but as professionals who had the courage to do what was right when it mattered most. Silence stretched on the line for long seconds. Riley could hear heavy breathing, the sound of men wrestling with years of conditioned fear. Finally, Harold Johnson's trembling but determined voice broke the silence. What exactly do you want us to do? Riley looked at Dexter, then at the clock. 37 minutes left. I want you to do something George never imagined you'd have the courage to do, she said. I want you to tell the truth. 30 minutes left. Riley hung up the phone and turned to Dexter, who was still holding his own after finishing the last call with the accountants. They're going to do it, she said, barely believing her own words. All 15 agreed to tell the truth. When? Dexter asked. Now, Riley replied, putting her phone away. They should already be on their way. Almost as if summoned by her words, the sound of footsteps echoed down the marble hallway. Riley and Dexter turned to see Harold Johnson walking toward them with purpose, followed by Robert Martinez, Thomas Chen, Kevin O'Sullivan, and the rest of the accountants. Each one carried folders filled with documents, their expressions a mix of nervousness and determination. Mr. Lancaster, Harold said, stopping in front of Dexter. It's time to tell the truth. Riley smiled, feeling a wave of relief. But when she looked back through the glass into the conference room, she saw that George was already handing out pens to the board members. The signing was about to happen. We don't have time for subtlety, she said. We're going to have to interrupt the meeting directly. The door is locked, Dexter reminded her. Riley looked around and saw Margaret Sullivan still standing in the hallway, nervously watching the group that had gathered. Margaret, Riley called, you have the key to the meeting room, right? The assistant hesitated, glancing from Riley to the accountants, clearly torn between loyalty to George and what she was witnessing. I'm not sure if I should. Margaret, Harold intervened, his voice gentle but firm. Please, you've worked here for 15 years. You know something's wrong. The woman looked toward the meeting room, where George was still giving his presentation, then back at the determined group in front of her. Finally, she sighed and pulled a set of keys from her desk drawer. Main meeting room, she said, handing a golden key to Dexter. I hope I'm doing the right thing. Riley took the key from Dexter's hand. Trust me, you are. She unlocked the door and threw it wide open, abruptly interrupting George's presentation. Every head around the boardroom table turned at once to look at the unexpected intrusion. Sorry for the interruption, Riley said, stepping into the room with the 15 accountants behind her. But there's some important information you need to hear before you sign anything. George froze for a moment, clearly shocked to see all the accountants united. Then his expression shifted into a mask of indignant authority. This is unacceptable, he exclaimed. Mr. Morrison, call security immediately. This woman is not authorized to be here. Actually, she is, Dexter said, stepping into the room. As CEO of this company, I authorize her presence. A wave of murmurs rippled around the boardroom table. Dexter, George said, struggling to maintain control. You're clearly not thinking straight. This woman has manipulated you with conspiracy theories. Mr. Hartwell, Harold Johnson interrupted, stepping forward. With all due respect, you're the one who's manipulated us. All of us. He opened his briefcase and spread documents across the table. These are the real calculations for the merger with Meridian Corp., not the altered versions you forced us to prepare. Robert Martinez stepped up beside him. And here's the proof that Mr. George has personal information on each of us, which he's been using to blackmail us into lying. One by one, the other accountants began speaking up, sharing their stories of coercion and threats. The expressions of the board members gradually shifted from confusion to horrified understanding. George tried to keep his composure. This is ridiculous, he protested. These are disgruntled employees trying to sabotage a legitimate deal. Then explain this, Riley said, connecting her phone to the room's sound system. She played the recording she had made of George, his clear, incriminating voice filling the air. Yes, everything is going according to plan. On Monday, I'm going to destroy Dexter's company from the inside. He won't even know what hit him. The silence that followed was absolute. George looked around the table, seeing the shock and disbelief on the board members' faces. This is out of context, he stammered. I was talking about a restructuring strategy. Riley played another clip, this one where George detailed how he blackmailed the accountants. Then another, where he admitted to embezzling money from the company. Contextualize that, she said coldly. George was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the faces around the table. Then something shifted in his expression. The mask of corporate respectability began to crumble. "You know what?" he said, his voice growing louder. "Maybe it was time someone did something." Dexter froze. "George." "No, Dexter." George exploded. 30 years. 30 years I've lived in your shadow, listening to everyone praise you, how brilliant you were, how visionary you were. And what was I? Dexter Lancaster's loyal best friend. The anger that had been buried for decades finally found its voice. "You always had everything handed to you," George went on, his words dripping with venom. "The best opportunities, the biggest successes, the recognition. And me, I worked twice as hard and got half the credit." "George, please," Dexter whispered, his voice breaking. "We were friends." "Friends?" George laughed bitterly. "You actually believe that?" "I pretended to be your friend for 3 decades, Dexter. I pretended to like you, pretended to support you, while deep down, I was waiting for you to fail." The words Dexter like physical blows. Riley could see the pain spreading across his face. "Every success you had was torture for me," George continued, completely losing control. "Every compliment you received, every bit of recognition, every victory, it was like a slap in my face. And finally, I found a way to take what should have been mine all along." The silence in the room was deafening. The board members were visibly horrified, not only by the fraud, but by the sheer cruelty of the betrayal being revealed. At that moment, the doors of the room opened again. 3 men in dark suits walked in, flashing FBI badges. "George Hartwell," the lead agent said, "you're under arrest for corporate fraud, blackmail, and embezzlement." George was handcuffed in silence, his rage fading into bitter resignation. As he was led away, he looked at Dexter one last time. "You never deserved anything you had," he muttered before being escorted out. When the room was finally empty, except for Riley, Dexter, and a few board members whispering among themselves, a heavy silence settled over them. Dexter stood in the middle of the room, staring at the spot where George had been just moments before. His hands trembled slightly. Riley approached him cautiously. "Dexter," she said softly, "I'm sorry, I know how much this must hurt." He looked at her, and she saw unshed tears in his eyes. 30 years, he murmured. 30 years of lies. How could I have been so blind? Riley reached out to touch him, but he instinctively stepped back. "No," he said, his voice hoarse. I can't do this right now. Dexter." "Riley," he stopped, struggling with his words. "I'm fallen for you. But I just found out my best friend hated me for 3 decades. How can I trust what I feel? How can I trust anyone again?" The pain in his voice broke Riley's heart. "I need time," he continued. "I need to process all of this before we can." Riley nodded, swallowing back her own tears. "I understand," she said softly. "I'll be here when you're ready." Dexter looked at her one last time before walking out, leaving Riley alone with the wreckage of a 30-year friendship and the fragile beginning of something that could have been beautiful. 2 months had passed since that turbulent day at Empire Tower. Riley Martinez was now in Chicago, organizing orders in her small office that always smelled of spices and dreams fulfilled. Her company, Riley's Rush, had grown from a desperate idea into a thriving gourmet delivery service catering to some of the city's finest restaurants. She had left Los Angeles a week after the Empire Tower scandal, not to run away, but to prove to herself that she was capable of building something of her own. The pain of Dexter's rejection was still there, but it had turned into fuel for her ambition. "Riley, we have a special order," said Marcus, her assistant, stepping into the office with a paper in hand. "Special how?" she asked without looking up from the delivery spreadsheet. "It's strange. Someone ordered the exact same lunch you used to deliver to that Empire Tower restaurant. Rice cooked to that precise point between moist and dry, grilled chicken without seasoning, freshly squeezed orange juice. Even the instructions are identical." Riley looked up, frowning. "What's the address?" Marcus checked the paper. "Empire Tower, Los Angeles, 47th floor." Riley's heart skipped a beat. She grabbed the paper from Marcus's hand and read it carefully. It was exactly right. Someone had ordered Dexter Lancaster's lunch to be delivered straight to his office. "Is this some kind of joke?" she murmured. "I don't know, but the payment's already processed, and they specifically requested that you make the delivery in person." Riley stared out the office window, watching the busy streets of Chicago below. She had built a new life here. A thriving business, loyal employees, even a few interesting suitors. Why would she go back to Los Angeles because of a strange order? But something inside her, maybe curiosity, maybe hope, made her grab her car keys. "Marcus, you're in charge of today's deliveries," she said, picking up the familiar thermal bag. "I have a trip to make." 6 hours later, Riley was standing in the lobby of Empire Tower, holding the same thermal bag she'd carried the day her life changed forever. The building looked exactly the same, but she felt completely different now. More confident, more independent, more in control of her own destiny. She headed toward the main elevators but stopped abruptly when she spotted a familiar figure waiting in the reception area. Dexter Lancaster was standing there, wearing the exact same suit he had worn on that fateful day, only this time it was perfectly clean, without a trace of ginger sauce. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi," she replied, slowly walking toward him. "Did you order yakisoba?" Dexter smiled, and Riley realized how much she had missed that smile. "Actually, I ordered the special lunch for the most stubborn CEO in Los Angeles," he said, "with extra ginger sauce and a chance to redeem myself." Riley set the thermal bag on the floor and crossed her arms. "Redeem yourself for what exactly?" Dexter took a deep breath, as if preparing for the most important speech of his life. "Riley, I've spent the last 2 months in therapy trying to process not just George's betrayal, but also how I was too much of a coward to accept what you meant in my life," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "I realized that my fear of trusting again almost made me lose the one person who had the courage to save me when everyone else failed." A few people in the lobby began to pay attention to the conversation, but Dexter didn't seem to care. "You risked your safety, your reputation. You even hung off the side of a 47-story building to protect me," he continued. "And when I finally had proof of your loyalty and courage, I rejected you because I was too hurt to recognize a gift when it was right in front of me." Riley felt tears forming in her eyes. "Dexter, I'm not done," he said, stepping closer. "I never forgot you, Riley. Not for a day, not even for an hour. You changed my life in every possible way, and I was too foolish to see it back then." He knelt right there, in the middle of the busy Empire Tower lobby, in front of executives, security guards, and surprised visitors. "Riley Martinez," he said, his voice echoing through the marble atrium, "would you give me a chance? Would you allow me to try to deserve you?" Riley looked at him. This man who had rejected her 2 months ago and was now humbling himself publicly for a second chance. She thought about the life she had built in Chicago, the independence she had fought for, the strong woman she had become, and she realized that everything had prepared her for this moment. "Do you promise not to doubt me if I tell you aliens invaded the cafeteria?" she asked, with the same humor he had missed so much. "I promise to personally investigate the cafeteria," he replied, laughing. "And if I tell you I saw Elvis in the elevator, I'll get you an autograph." Riley reached out her hand to help him up. "Then yes, Dexter Lancaster," she said, her voice strong enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "I love you and I'm willing to try again." The entire lobby erupted into spontaneous applause. Dexter stood and kissed her right there, a kiss that tasted like second chances and ginger sauce. 6 months later, on a Malibu beach at sunset, Dexter knelt again, this time holding a diamond ring that sparkled almost as brightly as Riley's eyes. "Riley Martinez," he said, "will you marry me?" Riley looked at the stunning ring, then at the man who had become the center of her universe. "Only if you promise never to doubt a delivery girl again," she replied, extending her hand to accept the ring. The wedding ceremony was held in the gardens of the Empire Tower, transformed into a celebration of love, second chances, and the triumph of the unexpected. Riley walked down an aisle covered in rose petals, wearing a dress that made her look like a princess, but with comfortable sneakers underneath. "Just in case," as she explained. All 15 former accountants were there, now minority partners in the new joint venture, Lancaster and Martinez Enterprises, a blend of Dexter's corporate expertise and Riley's entrepreneurial creativity. Harold Johnson was the best man, and in his speech, he said Riley had taught them all that courage isn't the absence of fear, but doing what's right despite it. When the judge asked if anyone objected to the marriage, Riley turned to the guests and said, "If George Hartwell is here disguised as a waiter, Now's your chance to speak." The joke drew loud laughter from everyone present. 6 months after the wedding, Riley sat in the office she now shared with Dexter, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other holding a profit report that showed how honesty and courage truly pay off. "Twins," she murmured, gently caressing her belly. "I hope you inherit your dad's business sense and Aunt Margaret's coordination skills, because if you take after your mom, we're going to have some serious problems with flying food." Dexter walked into the office at that moment, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Talking to yourself again?" he asked, kissing her forehead. "Talking to our future CEOs," she corrected him. "I'm explaining the company policy about not spilling lunch on important documents." Dexter laughed and sat beside her, placing his hand over hers on her belly. "You know what?" he said. "If it weren't for a spilled lunch, none of this would have happened." Riley smiled, thinking about how a simple delivery had turned into the greatest adventure of her life. "Well," she said, "I always knew I had a special talent for causing just the right chaos at just the right time." Outside, Los Angeles glimmered under the afternoon sun, and in the Empire Tower, an unlikely love story proved that sometimes the best things in life really do come disguised as disasters with ginger sauce. What did you think of Riley and Dexter's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And don't forget to check out more touching stories by clicking right here on the final screen.